This is Find Your Flow, a show about navigating the complexities of life and business through the lens of curiosity. I'm your host, Angelique, and I bring together experts to deliver responsibly curated conversations and perspectives that aim to progress people and the planet. So creativity is the capacity to develop ideas and to solve problems, but it's also recognizing opportunities that may come from it. It's a capacity we can all learn to use more of and more of effectively, especially when building thriving cultures of creativity. But when does creativity become toxic, and how can it actually propel stress and burnout? Today, we're going to be chatting with a good friend of mine who is the, topic owner. I don't know how to describe it. Taylor Cashdan has been talking about the anti-hustle culture for some time now and looking at ways that we can create more creative movements to replace it. So how can we build cultures of creativity? So my friend Taylor joining us today, he is a Raleigh-based multidisciplinary creative and community builder that is passionate about people, design, and all the intersections in between. He has a burning desire to collaborate with teams tasked with creating exceptional work for people who give a shit. I love it, Taylor. I love it. Welcome. I'm so excited to have you. And I guess just to kick things off, tell us about how your creative journey began.
How far back do you want to go?
All the way.
The story I like to tell is allegedly my first design job was photoshopping report cards for my friends in high school.
So hey, it's got to start somewhere.
Oh, it was great. They'd get the printout. This is to be clear, this is never messing with the actual grade. This was the paper that they were going to bring home, kind of thing. In this pretend world, that was my first job in design, and that was in the journalism office at the high school. So, and that's really where I got most of my start, was in the journalism world. I was actually writing.
Okay.
And then we needed to build out page layouts and cartoons and stuff to support the content. And that's kind of when I found oh, this could be a thing. I can write and then format it and then make it. And that's where my original trajectory was, to be a journalist. And it kind of pivoted slowly a little bit further away from writing and content into design and visual.
I love that. Well, and it kind of reminds me, you said that you did use Photoshop at the time though, right? What was that thing we used to all have on our Microsoft desktops? Paint.
Oh, that was MS Paint. Yeah.
I remember trying to get those are my first days of creativity. I'm I'm just going to sit here and draw with all the different tools I think I have in front of me.
Oh yeah.
Amazing. Well, I guess in that, I want to chat more about your thoughts on anti-hustle culture. You've done talks on the topic of stress addiction, from morning coffee to the cardiac wing. I mean, tell us more.
Yeah, the Reader's Digest version is one morning I woke up from a dead sleep. My chest was pounding. I was covered in sweat, very disoriented, figuring I just had a nightmare or a bad dream or something, right? So I got out, got ready for work, took a shower, went to the office. And when I sat down at my desk, I was both winded and full of energy, which was a really weird, combination of feelings. And mind you, I was 24 at the time. And I felt this weird, pitter patter in my chest, some sort of tension. So I'd asked a coworker to come and I was this is gonna be weird, but take your hand and put it here and let me know if you feel what I'm feeling, or is it just phantom, And they were I'm not sure, but that doesn't feel right. So I immediately went to the doctor, and turns out I had a resting heart rate of 180 beats a minute. So sitting still. And for reference, most people are between 60 and 90 beats in their resting state, So I was over the working out range, kind of situation. And after a bunch of tests and all this other stuff, they basically drilled it down. Once I cleared the health scans, no drugs, no other, family things, no hidden diseases, whatever. They're it's stress related. That's how they deduced what was occurring. And that was basically asking me, after, again, passing all the tests, what's your average day? And I would explain, I'd get up for work, I'd go to work, I'd come home, I'd do a little freelance stuff, I'd go to a meetup, I'd have dinner with some friends, I'd get back home, finish up some client work, yada, yada. And they were no, not a week in a day. I was no, that's Tuesday. And they were oh, okay, we've very much isolated the problem here. So it was directly overwork.
Gosh, yeah. I mean, I think as creatives too, I hear you. It sounds like this was at a time you were already working full time for a company. You go home and you have your, I guess, we call it side hustle or your freelance opportunities that you're working on. And then you have, like you are a community builder. You're always trying to bring people together and you do a great job at it. And sometimes it just burns us out. So what did they tell you as far as like how did you start to get more control of that?
Well, the hard part was like it's really tough, especially in the creative space, like to draw the line between work and play, right? So like everything that I was doing, I enjoyed. But
Yeah.
our brains don't give a shit about whether we're having fun or we're working. Either way, it's still on and working and expending energy, right? So
Yeah.
that line didn't exist for me. It was just like, okay, I'm enjoying this. I'm just going to keep going until I'm tired, and then when I
Mhm.
fall asleep, I'll crash and get up in the morning, do it again because I enjoy what I do, kind of
Right.
thing. Um, and whether it was literally doing design work, whether it was organizing, whether it was doing client work, whether it was reading up or testing new techniques, didn't matter. Either way, I was always on.
Mm.
So when I got to the hospital for this cardiac event, I had to stay for 3 days. And the first thing, like to give you context of like how focused I was on getting this stuff done, is
Mhm.
once I was in the hospital bed and they're finally like, all right, we're done with our tests. Like you're sitting there waiting. Like I was like, great, I need my computer so I can tell my team I'm not going to make it in today. So they have the things they need. And they were like, no, like you're here because of this. Like give
Wow.
us all your stuff. Like took my phone, took everything. They were like, for the rest of the day, at a minimum, you're going to do nothing. They're like, text your boss so let them know you're not coming in,
Yeah.
but that's it. Like you're done. And I just had to like sit with myself and be like, well, what the hell do I do now? When you start to tie like your identity to the things you're doing, it starts to create
Mhm.
this little crisis loop of like, well, if I don't have these things, I'm not doing these things. What and who am I? All that loop. And mind you, I'm like sitting in the hospital bed with all these things on me, just like analyzing my life at 24.
Yeah.
Going, what the hell am I
Yeah.
doing? How did I end up here? Meanwhile, the doctors are like, we've never seen, they diagnosed me with something called atrial fibrillation. It's basically when
Okay.
the chambers of your heart don't communicate to each other and just beat whenever they feel like, because it's a very like layman's description. And they were
Mhm.
like, we haven't seen this in someone this young, like at this institution. So we don't really know, how to handle it. Like you're too young to be on these meds. You're not old enough to qualify for these other things. So it's kind of like, we just gotta wait and see. So I just immediately had this like reckoning that it flipped my whole productivity thing on my head. Like I had to like cut stuff out, decide, what things were worthwhile to do, what things I needed to do versus what I wanted to do, and then how to
Mhm.
properly pace myself, get a kind of a somewhat of a schedule in place to at least start to like chop off the things that were, harmful, so to speak.
Sure.
And then it was the reality of dealing with overcommitment of going, well, am I doing these things because I want to do them, or they're leading to the next thing, or because I signed up for them and feel guilty canceling, right? Or they were something I was interested in a month ago, and now I'm not interested, but I'm kind of in it, and I don't want to not finish it,
Yeah.
kind of thing. And so it was a really strong exercise in learning how to say no, and then being
Yes.
able to be okay with that weirdness for a minute, and then realize that the people are always like, well, if you say no to an opportunity, like it's not going to come back up, and that's never true, right? And
Right.
we know that, right? I mean, it's scary in the moment, right, when you turn down the big project or the dream client or whatever, but there's always more things to be done.
Yeah.
Always, it'll always come back. Maybe not that exact thing, but something else comes up similar, just like it, whatever it is. But that fear of turning it down, right, often leads to this. All right, I'll just add it to the calendar. I'll squeeze it in here, which is what I was doing all the time because I was like, I
Of
want to
course.
take in everything, right? I have the chance now to do it. I might as well. I have the energy, blah blah blah. But you're
Right.
burning the candle not only at both ends, but in the middle and underneath and on the top and on the side, and you're underneath the whole fire, and it's bad. Yeah.
Well, yes, and I feel like sometimes the power of no and the understanding of no doesn't really come into play until you get to the point where you're like, I have to say no.
Right.
I've got to be better at prioritizing these things. And I've hit with that too, where sometimes it's not even until I get to the point in which I'm about to do whatever I agreed to that I'm like, probably should have said no to this. I'm trying to take things on. I didn't have anything on my calendar, but I could have just sat, and focused on XYZ that might have been, propelling me in another way.
Which I'm
Do you
sure
think
many people listening to this will resonate with, right? That's the
uh,
common thread. The difference was with me, my body was like, no, we're
right,
stopping
that's
today.
true.
And that
Right,
was it.
right.
I didn't have a
Your
choice.
body shut down. They that made that decision for you that day.
Exactly.
What do you think that creatives are more prone to something like this?
It's funny because a lot of folks have asked that. So this stress talk kind of, I don't want to say blew up, but it became a thing. Like it was a lot bigger response than I expected.
Because you
And that's
first spoke about it at AIGA.
yeah. The first place I ever gave the talk was at the High Five conference, the marketing conference, in conjunction with like an AIGA partnership. And then I gave it to the local chapter, and then it kind of landed the first, big conference after that was Creative South. And then went on to do How and a handful of others that just kind of, rolled on from there, and a couple of like private, team building things and that sort of thing, podcasts, etc. But the common thread is often like, do you think this is isolated to creatives? And, the example I often go is, well, I don't know. But when you ask me, right, like, do I hear of like accountants going home and crunching numbers in their free time? No. Right. But do we hear of like designers coming home and wanting to make things for their family and friends and whatever and for fun? Yes. So I don't know if it's necessarily isolated. I think the idea, though, is that regardless of your discipline, meaning like the subject matter, not your ability to say no, regardless of your discipline, the way your brain reads activity is no different, right? Once you're on, you're on. There's no off if you're doing those activities, right? Or even adjacent activities. So if it's accounting, if it's design, it doesn't matter. If there is no break in that, even if it's like a different kind of that thing or a different flavor or for a different intent, your brain is still on and active and engaging. So when it's in that mode, it's still in work mode. It doesn't have a distinction between, oh, this is work adjacent, but I'm doing it for fun.
This is freelance mode. Like it's more relaxing to focus on this.
Well, you can even take freelance is still work, right? You're still making money. You could say if it's, you're just doing a doodle, right? You're doing something for fun, what you think is relaxing,
right?
Is actually sometimes your brain still in work mode, right? Especially if it's the thing to do for money normally, right? There's no distinction there.
Right.
Like the difference being like, if I came home and did accounting stuff, right, as a designer, sure, that's a different task, right? Same like an accountant came home and drew. But if I as a designer came home to then draw, it's still in the same vein, right? I may not be on a computer, but I'm still doing the creative work. So my brain is referencing things I know about because of work and whatever, and all the synapses are firing, and it's all the same, channel.
Now, those are some interesting scenarios to dive into too, because like you said, I mean, if an accountant comes home and they decide to start doodling, that could maybe be seen as therapeutic to them, or, the off switch for them. So I think there's so many different scenarios and questions that we can kind of dive into on that. But it's something that I think about too in the creative space is, I would spend a lot of my days very similar, where I was working in creative production. And then I'd have my nonprofit creative freelance work that I would do. And then I would still try to make time for what I felt was my own art. And that would be playing in the ceramic studio or going in, drawing, painting, etc. And then what I found actually is that when I would try to put the time into my own personal projects, it still felt like work. And so it actually drained out of me the enjoyment that I had from some of those things. So it's an interesting space to be in. I don't know if it just depends on the projects that you have at play and what you're working on. But I think where we're really getting is that like, you've got to have that balance between any of the projects that you're doing and actual physical rest. Like we've got to sleep, eat, just chill and be okay chilling. But one of the things you said before this that I thought was interesting is even when you're at the hospital, you were like, well, I need my computer so I can kind of work on these things. And then to have to sit in your own space, in your own quiet, in your own silence with your own mind as a creative or anybody, that is so tough. So how did you deal with it? How did your work respond? What was next out of that scenario?
Well, it's hard for any boss to be like, oh, you're in the hospital, please finish your task. So it kind of baked in. But I think the thing there, right, is that there's a power in being okay with boredom, right? And then realizing that boredom is actually a very important state to be in. Right? Like the easiest thing that a lot of people resonate with is like, when do we have the best ideas? Right? In the shower,
you're bored,
taking a shit, or while you're driving. Right?
Yeah.
The things when you don't have pen and paper in your hands, you can't reach for your phone. The thing when you're focusing on something else you're doing and your brain is doing something else in the background. Right? When you're not focused on the task at hand. So that's the idea behind boredom, right? If you can find moments to just free your head, right, from like whatever the task is, and that could be as simple as like going for a walk, right? Just closing the computer. just changing the medium will often help you get to the problem you're trying to solve anyway, right? As opposed to like staring at the screen and doing the thing. So that was what that moment kind of was for me, is like I hadn't taken a breather to recognize like what I was doing. I was just in like basically automatic mode. I know I got to do this. I clock in the morning, I do this thing, I go to the next thing. It was like a robot, and I wasn't, to your point, resting. That's the big one, right? But I also wasn't realizing the toll it was taking on not only my mentality, right, and my physical being, but effectively the work too, right? Because once you spread too thin, your work starts to decrease, and it's hard to notice that when everything's decreasing just a little bit, right? Everything just seems all the same, and then you're like, oh, actually, I didn't do that as well as I thought I could have. Whatever. Right. No one's going to realize, and so a lot of times people don't, right? Because we hold ourselves to a higher standard than anyone else does. But when you start to feel not good about the things you're producing, right, or the things that you're putting your time into, or to your point, where you get to the edge of it and you go, oh, I really didn't want to do this. Why am I here? Why am I doing? That's something to realize, right? Now, some of that is like could be performance anxiety or like moment, the stress rate before. But the way I like to think about it, right, is like if it happens once, it's okay. If it happens two, it's like okay. If it happens a third time, it's a pattern, right? Like that's something to recognize, and then realize like your body, your brain, something is trying to tell you something, and it may not mean you need to shut it down, right, or turn down that opportunity, or whatever. But you need to recognize that something's happening, and it's not going to be clear as to like, is it thing one, thing two, or thing three that's causing it? But you need to then look at those things in unison and go, okay, something's got to give, and that may mean decreasing all, it may mean decreasing one, whatever it is. But I think the easy thing to grab for is like, oh, clearly this thing that triggered this stress is the problem, but that's not always the case. Like it wasn't for me. I immediately was like, oh, it's because I'm working a lot. And it's like, it wasn't the work. It was the overcommitment, which was directly tied to the work, but a separate track.
Right. Well, the empowerment that comes from, I love how you recognize that there was a pattern. And I think that can sometimes take people longer. Even for myself, it sometimes takes longer than you wish, but then you're just kind of like, you're kind of playing this voice in your head of like, all right, I've realized this is a pattern, but just one more time, maybe this is the breakthrough of it. And it's just like, no, when you recognize the pattern, you recognize you have to make a change in that. But one of the things I also want to break into, is looking at, we've worked at creative agencies, we've worked in freelance. One of the things that would get me a lot in working in advertising was like, all right, we're going to have a creative brainstorm at 3 p.m. and you got to show up and bring all your best ideas to the table. I just don't feel like it happens that way. And to say like, oh yeah, okay, that's when I'm going to turn on this creative juice. But how do we look at literally going back and creating creative cultures internally? How have you seen it best play out where companies or leadership is creating a culture where creatives can flourish, where there's the recognition when somebody's getting burned out? I guess a few different questions in there, but I mean, like, how has your last organization attempted to solve for this?
Yeah, I think the first thing is just acknowledging that like creativity in its raw form is and always will be in contention with business goals, right? Because the whole point of creativity, right, often is like free flow and idea and unconstrained, and like business is like time box deliverable, driving revenue, right? And to your point, like you can't always just turn on the 3 p.m. creative light. It doesn't work that way. Could you prepare? Could you set up the right conditions and environment to foster the right thing at 3 o'clock? Sure. But also like, we're humans, right? Like you can't just turn on and turn off these things. And, I think the hard part is we get into a pattern or a habit of like, oh, you know what? It worked well that last time, so we can do that over and over and over, right? And part of business is finding that predictability to create a pace, to create a cadence, to do things. And I think oftentimes, like at organizations, whether you're freelancing or you're in-house, doesn't matter, right? We strive for that schedule, that consistency, that production mindset of like, okay, if we do it this way every time, we'll always get this result. And it just doesn't work that way, right? That's not how life works. That's not how creativity works. That's not how humans work, right? And like we can unpack capitalism and all that stuff for days, but that's basically what it's hinting at, right? Is like we're trying to take this, I'm going to be really like woo, but this like raw, floofy power and put it into a box and access it when we want it. And that's just not how it works. Right. And there are some people that can just turn it on and turn it off. And those people are great. But I'd argue they probably have the same problems that we're talking about now. They're just not as frequent, or they are not outward about it. Right. And again, I think the challenge too is, like I mentioned earlier, about like not being able to turn on and turn off. Like sometimes you're like, you have that meeting at 3 o'clock, you have no ideas, right? You get home, you're walking your dog, you're making dinner, whatever. It's 9 p.m. and you have that idea, right? What
Yeah.
do? You write it down because you have it at the moment. But technically, then you're back to working, right? But if inspiration strikes, got to
Yeah.
capture it, right? Bottle it
Right.
and bring it to the next meeting or the next day or whatever. So it's this catch-22 of just always being in this weird cycle, right? And that's why I think it's interesting when you have different organizations that are trying to say like, the remote work thing's an interesting caveat here, right? The idea that like you need an office space to foster creativity and idea sharing and whatever is a very forced concept,
Yeah.
right? I'm not saying it doesn't work, because it does, and it's proven in many ways.
Works
But
well. Yeah.
on the flip side, right, sometimes that's like the whole micromanagement thing. Like if you got people breathing over your neck, it's really hard to come up with new novel things, but on the flip side, like the remote thing, sometimes it's too freeing where you're like, well, I have all the time in the world. And I'm not,
Right.
everyone's taking advantage of it, because I genuinely think people aren't. But when you have the opportunity to go, okay, I know, for example, that I work best between, or I generate the most ideas between this period of the day, and I no longer have someone breathing down my neck about doing it at the time that they want it. Sometimes that's better output, right? So it's an interesting like tie in there of like, sometimes it's the conditions that you're working in. You asked about like companies and cultures, and I think that's part of the idea is like you have to at some point meet where they're at, right? If they work best under these conditions, try to emulate those conditions. And it's not the easiest thing to do at scale, right? If you have 2 or 3 people, easy. You have 10, 15 people, challenging. You have hundreds of people, impossible, right? Because you got so many different schedules, so many different things. So it's an interesting nut to crack, and I don't know that there really is a black and white answer.
That's absolutely fair. Like you said, I mean, if we were managing creative teams of 2 to 8 people, that's one thing. And I think and I've been in a lot of different brainstorms where, there's different workshop experiences, Post-it notes, and, kind of having fun and games with it. But no, you can't scale something like that to 100 plus people in these large scale organizations.
Right.
And I think, we do try. I think that there's a lot of good effort out there, and I'd love to hear from, you or even like other viewers, if there's ideas that they've had in creative brainstorms that have helped to really cultivate the creative and get those ideas flowing. But I want to also focus on the individuals too. I think it's one thing to say like, okay, this is when our ideas don't start to flow, but when it comes to the mental well-being of creatives too, I mean, like you said, even if we're off of work and we're getting an idea in the shower, like we're constantly thinking about how do we solve these problems? How do we solve these things at play? What do you think we can do, whether it's as team leaders or team players, to take notice of how that take a temperature check of our teammates in the creative space?
I mean, man, sometimes it's as simple as asking, right? I mean, that's I think that gets overlooked. Like I think people try to overmanage a situation without going, hey, so and so, when do you work best? How do you work best? What are your conditions of success, right? And it doesn't mean you're going to meet them, but it just means giving them a chance to express it, because there's a good chance there's a few commonalities across other teammates. And if you can set up even pockets of space for that behavior or that interaction to thrive, then you're already doing better than you were before, right? And I think that's especially important for number one, like junior and associate level folks, if you want to like do leveling, because they're usually not accustomed to having to work in a large group or on a specific deadline or with constraints, right? So making sure that their aspirations aren't like, well, I want to work whenever I want. You're like, no, okay, you work for a company, like some of it's structured, but to meet them where they are, right? To be okay, well, do you want a day to just brainstorm? Let's try that, right? So as a good leader, it's being inquisitive, right? It's understanding, what your team needs. And again, I think the 2 groups that most often are best suited and best served by that sort of behavior are like the new folks and the quiet people in the room, right? Call them introverts if you want, but the people that don't speak up, right? The not the loudest folks in the room, because they're often the ones that get overlooked.
Yes. I have been seeing a lot of Harvard Business Review just wrote about that as well. Like ask them questions, give them space, give them airtime. The folks that are seemingly the quietest in the meetings. So I love that you said that, because it's absolutely true. I mean, I've seen myself in that position sometimes too, where I'm like, you want to say something, you want to speak up, and then you don't for whatever reason. But it's sometimes those people that have definitely the ideas that you want to hear in that space too. So I love that. Yeah. I mean, it's just taking a temperature check and just asking a very human question of like, how are you really? How do you work best? Do you believe in the in those like personality tests? Do you think that you can gauge a good bit about a person through an Enneagram or Myers-Briggs?
I think they're fun exercises. I mean, like I've every time I've ever taken the Myers-Briggs, I've got ENFJ, like every single time, no matter where I've taken it. So like
Hey, that's me
textbook.
too.
Yeah,
Yeah.
right. So some of them, but I also found like when answering those questions myself, sometimes I'm emulating what I want to be, not what I am.
Yeah.
So sometimes we course correct ourselves. So we're not really being honest because we want to be that other individual that we're talking about, right? We're not being real about like, no, I wouldn't do this thing, or I wouldn't do this bad behavior because the way the question is phrased. So I think
Right.
there's a lot of interesting, background on those. Like, so what I would say is like, if you're going to try to do those, like take a couple different ones and then get an aggregate, because sometimes the question is phrased differently, but regardless, I think they're all helpful tools. I think that the risk is like when folks over-index on either one, test, or that is the way. But, it's always interesting to see also the differences in elevation of an individual in like a company's hierarchy and how they quote unquote test. As an example, I was working at an institution where we realized that one of the descriptors of the test was looking for was like intuition versus feeling. And in the sense that like people either go with their gut and like that's the way they go, or they go with how they feel, in the moment. Yeah. And we realized that the whole executive team was all intuition. There was no feeling. But the middle managers were feeling. And then the folks at like the individual contributors were a mixed bag. So it was an interesting story because then it was like, all right, so is one wrong? Is one right? Right? What's the balance of how decisions are made if everything's being based off intuition and not feeling? Right? Or how are people being managed if everything's feeling instead of intuition? Right? So is there a difference in how those people interact with each other, how they interact with their direct reports, how they make decisions, how they do all these things based on what, again, one of the many notional tests are saying that the commonality between these individual groups is that this particular trait exists. So it makes you start to wonder, or at least it could elevate the idea of, okay, maybe we need to phrase things differently for certain individuals. Same point, right? Different language that they understand, right? Or so that we can connect with them, because sometimes, right, folks look up the ladder and they go, it's really cold up there. They're very stone-faced and official. And maybe that's the intuition and not the feeling, who knows? Yeah. But the more folks can be like self-aware of that, like if you're an intuition person or a feeling person, that like you are one or the other, you can, put on a hat to masquerade as the other at the right time, in an authentic way that allows you to then connect with the people that you may be missing, or vice versa. So I think it's a helpful tool. What I don't like is when they're used as like category buckets for like, this is how this individual always will act. It's like, okay, no, it's a Tuesday and it's raining. He responded this way to a question. Like, that's not how
you can't use it as like Bible. Like, it's not going to be like, okay, like this is a fun exercise for you to kind of understand a general compass maybe, but at the end of the day, you've got to go off human instincts and understand that. And just, again, break it down to the human level of asking questions and getting to know somebody. Okay. So I want to go back to, stress addiction and what happened so after your experience and after your burnout, how did things change at the organization you were working for? And how did, I guess, maybe that reshape culture, or how you influence the culture that you're part of having that type of experience?
Yeah, they were very flexible and like understand that I was dealing with some shit, I had to kind of figure it out. My manager at the time responded, as you expect they would, kind of gave me the space to figure it out, but also was like, we also have some deadlines. So like, let us know what's going on. Like, you just disappear, which is totally fair. But I also realized that there was part of me that acknowledged that I sort of created that environment for myself. Based on the decisions I'd made, right? So certain expectations were then, made because I set that tone. And sometimes those things are really hard to break without changing the environment. So what I realized was not only was I starting to dislike the work I was doing, but I disliked the environment. And that wasn't necessarily the company or the people or anything. It was the space that I made for myself because of that. and the
Personal
pressure.
accountability.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, I decided, I think it was like a year or so after that to just make a transition to something different, challenge myself with something new, change scenery, gave me a good hard reset, where you can only change so many things if all you're moving is the pictures on the wall, kind of thing.
Yeah. Yeah.
So to get an entire change of everything was what helped me a little more.
Okay.
But it took time, and there was many other things that I changed, in between then. But I kind of had that realization towards the end that was like, all right, I've fixed my sleep schedule, I've stopped committing, but there's something still that's like holding me to this thing that I just can't shake. And maybe an environment change is what did it, and that was one of the many things that kind of propelled me into realizing, all right, I can make tangible changes, have to do something different. Maybe that's a different company, different career, whatever it is. In my case, it was just different group, different team, different industry, same job, but something a little different that I just needed to shake myself out of the rut I was churning in that no one could have helped me get out except for myself.
Absolutely. Yes. And I think that, again, it goes back to the personal accountability for what you saw and the patterns that you saw that you created. I mean, obviously working in an environment is one thing, but I mean, I was guilty of that too. It's like, if I'm answering emails till 1:00 in the morning, then my clients are going to expect that of me. If, I'm following up on my vacation or sending, drafts of things on a Saturday, well, then my organization is going to expect that. And maybe even at that point, believe that to be my working style, even though I might be drowning and not thinking of it. I just want to get out there and go.
Or you may be thinking of it, but don't know how to change it. Right. And I think that to be completely clear, like that wasn't a realization I randomly fell upon. Like that was through therapy. And like, I realized like, oh, they were like, you should unpack that a little more, or let's talk about that for a second. And then I'm like, damn it. Like now fine. It's me, I didn't come to that conclusion on my own.
Well, and that's just the beauty of experience too. I think we've learned it's like, sometimes you have to learn things the hard way, and it just takes trial and error to kind of get there, unfortunately. But, I think these are some great points of, how can we, I know we were talking about like the building of culture, but I think we've almost landed on the aspect of, the creative individual's responsibility to themselves and their creative process to set boundaries, the power of no, understanding limits, recognizing patterns, and especially the aspect of setting and, following through with expectations, because those things are hard to retract. Once you've set those, it's really hard to then say, hey, I'm going to go ahead and reshape this now. And I'm not going to be responding to you at all hours of the day, and I'm not going to be available. So I think it's an interesting collective component of how every individual plays into the whole, as with everything. So I think the power of the culture comes from everybody who contributes to it and how willingly they are open to being vulnerable and talking about what their needs are as a creative.
No, I think you hit the nail on the head. I think the other thing that I want to circle back to is you mentioned what I argue is often a bit of a trap, in that you said something along the lines of like, sometimes you got to go through the hard thing to get through it. Right. And I think you're right, generally speaking. But the other side of that is some of the things that are hard don't need to be as hard as they are. Right. And that's mainly because we don't tell each other that, hey, this thing is hard. You can maybe avoid it if you don't do this. Right. Like we don't share because it's vulnerability, right? It's your point. Like it's hard to do that. And that's frankly how this like whole stress talk thing kind of unfolded. Like it was never meant to be this thing I went and like paraded around and told people and made a thing out of. Like it was literally like someone had asked me at one of the meetups I was at, like, hey, where you been? It's been a couple weeks, since we saw you. And then I just explained what had happened. And that happened a few times. And then, it was kind of surreal. Like people like would start to pull up their chair, and kind of listen in. And then someone pulled me aside. They're like, you have something here. And it's not that like, we want you. And then immediately I was like, wait, do I want to commit to this? Right. And then I was like, well, there's a portion of this that like, there's a vein here, right? Of like, I have been through something shitty. And, obviously mine was very extreme. Like people who normally get stressed out and stuff, I hope you don't end up in the hospital like I did. But, I am the extreme case. But if telling my ridiculous story, makes folks pause for a minute so they don't end up where I was, then it's worth it. Right.
Yes.
So I have to be careful too, like not to, triple, quadruple book things. And if I have a stressful work week or a long deadline coming up, like I'm not going to book a talk or a podcast or whatever on top of that, like I need to be mindful and careful of that. But anytime I have the chance to re-bring this up with teams or at conferences or with other creatives or non-creative industries. I mean, I've given the talk to non-creatives as well, and then you just flavor it a little differently, but it's the same point, right? And
It
I feel a little bit obligated to like make sure that, you know, if you're feeling anything like what I was feeling, just know that like there's a risk to it and there are ways around it. And that's part of the, you know, the points in the talk is like, if you take a moment to like ask yourself the hard questions, you say fuck the things you shouldn't be doing in the first place. You incubate the, you know, the things that you need to be doing, and then you learn to just be, you know, in the moment. And there's like a little like funny, like that actually it spells out AFib, which is the shorthand for atrial fibrillation, the condition I have. So it's like a fun little design pun. But the idea is there's a 4-step like mental process you can go through to analyze the situation you're in to see, is this good for me or is it bad? And then you got to make that call. Like, no one can do that for you, you know, but like I felt, you know, part of the, you know, me experiencing this and folks hearing it and wanting to learn from it, it was important to me. So being able to then express it on venues like this so folks can hear like, hey, there's another way. May not be perfect, but at least acknowledging it is enough.
Hey, and like you said, if it can change the course of one person's life who hears this story, then it's worth it.
Yeah.
Totally worth it. Well, we didn't even get to some of the questions, you know, about just creativity. And there's so much that I'd love to explore with you. And I'm still working on the book that you sent me also. So I think maybe into a little bit more of that. And hopefully I didn't lose you here at the end. I think, oh, there you go. You almost froze. I'm going to to your portfolio as well as your LinkedIn, but is there some place that folks can find you, and where do you prefer to be found? And then where can we hear the talk?
Yeah, I'm at Taylor Cashdan on all social medias. YouTube, portfolio, the whole nine is all the same, and everything's linked on the portfolio. So you can kind of dig around there and find what you need.
Perfect. Well, Taylor, I look forward to more talks to come, and you know, excited for folks to give some feedback on here. You know, whether this is something that you've experienced or it's something that, you know, you're trying to better combat on your own team. Would love to keep the conversation going, and of course, if you have any other topics, would love to dive into those conversations. So, thank you again, Taylor. We'll talk very soon.